This is a project about puppeteering. It's Project Puppeteer.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Project Puppeteer. My name is Alana. And my name is Bucky. This is a continuation of my previous video where I talked about how I made the body for my puppet, including the mouth plate. Today I'm going to show you how I made the eyes and the arms. So without any further ado, here's how I made my first puppet, Part 2 edition. Eyes are probably the easiest part of a puppet to make. The difficult part is placement. Poor placement of the eyes, specifically the pupils, can ruin the entire puppet. I'll talk more about this later. The type of material you use for the eyes depends on whether you want them to lay flat on the head of your puppet or, like Buggy here, have them sitting on top. Many professional puppet makers make their eyes out of resin and cast them in molds. But if you want something a little more easily accessible, what I used for Buggy were ping pong balls that I painted with several layers of white acrylic paint. Using spray paint would probably look a little nicer, but what I liked about using the acrylic paint was that it added a little extra reinforcement to the eyes, so they wouldn't break as easily. Hey, watch it! Oops, sorry! Another thing I like to use for puppet eyes are these wooden half spheres. And what's great about these is they have a flat edge to them, so they sit really nicely on top of a puppet, just like this. I do recommend that you paint these before attaching them to your puppet. To attach the eyes to the puppet, I used contact cement, nothing fancy. You could even use hot glue if you like. Now for the pupils, again, you could use a lot of different things. I've seen people use the little toy eyes that you find on stuffed animals. Some people punch circles out of a sheet of felt or velvet and stick those on. What I personally like using are Velcro dots, or these fabric stickers that people usually use for moving furniture. If you're lucky enough to find these in a darker color, I highly recommend going with that, but I did have to paint these. Now I mentioned earlier that proper placement of the pupils is crucial, and that has to do with something called eye focus. Eye focus is essentially how a puppet makes eye contact. Making eye contact helps us connect with other people, and puppets are no exception. Puppets don't have the ability to move their eyes, so you want to put the pupils on in a way that no matter which direction the puppet is facing, it always appears to be looking at something. As such, you don't actually want the pupils to be right in the middle of the eyes. You actually want to focus them a lot closer towards the center of the puppet, yet not so close to the center that the eyes appear to be crossed. A trick I learned is to stick your pupils onto the end of a pin. That makes it a lot easier to adjust the eye focus, and then when you're done, just take the pin out. I recommend just playing around and adjusting the eye focus until you're happy with how it looks. Moving on to the arms. Oh my goodness, this was the most difficult and time-consuming part of making the puppet, hands down. No pun intended. Well, maybe a little. For the arms themselves, I printed out a pattern, again, from Kreutinger.com, link in the description, and traced 2 arms out onto some fabric that I had doubled over. If you're sewing the arms on machine like I did, it's a lot easier to just sew everything together before cutting it out. Make sure to leave an opening right here. You also want to leave an opening right around here. That's so we can fit the hands of the puppet inside later. The hands of the puppet are actually made out of foam. This is a polyurethane foam that you can find at most craft or fabric stores. Since the foam I used was 1 inch thick, I cut out 2 hands and split them in half down the middle, so I ended up with 4. If you have 1/2 inch thick foam, you can just cut out 4 hands. Moving on to this part. Buggy is what's known as a hand and rod puppet, meaning his hands and arms are controlled using these arm rods. This is probably the most common type of puppet that people use, both in live performances and on television. For the arm rods themselves, most people use welding rod. But if you want something that's a bit easier to find, you can do what I did and use a metal coat hanger. I just used a pair of pliers to unbend the coat hanger into one long piece, and then cut it in half to create 2 equal-sized rods. Most puppet arm rods tend to be about 16 inches long. I think Buggy's are a little bit shorter than that. Find whatever length works best for you, but if you're not sure, 16 inches is a good place to start. Next, I bent the ends of the rods into a P shape, fed the steel wire through, and then twisted it to create the fingers. Next, I laid it out over one of the foam hands and bent the wires over to make sure that they fit, and to ensure that none of the ends would be poking out through the hand. If you really want to ensure that nothing ends up poking out, you can do what I did and encase the wires in a layer of hot glue. After that, I applied contact cement to two of the foam hands and sandwiched the wires in between. I then repeated this process for the other hand. Next, I had to fit the foam hand inside of the little gap that I left in the fabric arm. Now, this took a lot of patience, but I did eventually get it to fit. Then, I just repeated that for the other arm and stitched the gap closed. Next, I filled the rest of the arm using fiber fill and stitched that end closed too. Now for the handles, I used doweling rod that was 5/8 of an inch in diameter. You can easily find this at a local hardware store. With some help from my dad, we cut out two pieces that were each 5 inches long, and then drilled a little hole just off center. The reason you want to drill the hole off center is because it creates a little space for your thumb to rest on the handles. Now to prevent the arm rods from twisting inside the handle over time, I used a sanding tool to create little notches in the rods themselves. Then I just coated the ends of the rods in some super glue and inserted them into the holes that were drilled in the handle. Then after a quick coat of paint, all that was left to do was stitch the arms to the rest of the puppet, and voila! Alright, I hope you all enjoyed learning about puppet making. I did. In my future videos, I'll be talking a lot more about how to bring a puppet to life and give it some character, as well as doing some more puppeteering of my own. If you have any ideas for future episode topics, feel free to leave a comment and I'll see what I can do. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!